The last of the Vance silver, a set of tarnished dessert spoons, lay wrapped in felt within Ilara's worn travelling case. They were a pathetic remnant of a life that had evaporated like mist in a harsh morning sun. Her father, a baron with a heart more given to optimistic speculation than to sound finance, had left her with little more than a good name and a mountain of debts that had consumed everything. The townhouse in London, the modest country estate, the very clothes from their wardrobes. Now, at 23, Ilara Vance, who had been raised to manage a household, found herself seeking a position to merely serve in one. The letter in her hand was crisp, the ink a severe, uncompromising black. It offered her the post of governess at Ashbourne Manor, the seat of the Marquis of Ashbourne, Lord Alastair Blackwood. The solicitor who had arranged the placement had been brief, his expression grim. "The Marquis is a reclusive man, Miss Vance. The location is remote. The child, his daughter, is said to be of a delicate constitution." Delicate was a word used to obscure a multitude of difficulties, Ilara knew. And reclusive, when applied to a man of such rank and wealth, often meant something far darker than a simple desire for privacy. But she had no other prospects. The other offers had been humiliatingly sparse, contingent on her willingness to serve families who had once been her social inferiors and would relish her fall. Ashbourne Manor, for all its rumoured gloom, offered a respectable salary, and more importantly, distance. It was a place to disappear, to lick her wounds in private. The journey north was a gradual shedding of civilization. The rolling hills of the south gave way to starker, more dramatic landscapes, the sky a vast, indifferent grey. The final stage of the journey was in a carriage sent by the estate, a black lacquered conveyance with the Blackwood crest, a raven clutching a sprig of nightshade, emblazoned on the door. The horse's hooves seemed to be the only sound in a world muffled by fog. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and stone. When the manor finally emerged from the swirling mists, it did not so much appear as congeal out of the gloom. Ashbourne was not a house. It was a geological feature, a great beast of granite and slate that seemed to have risen from the moorland itself. Its mullioned windows were like 100 vacant eyes staring out into the desolation. No smoke curled from its many chimneys. No lights warmed its windows, though it was late afternoon and the day was already dying. Ilara's heart, which she had thought too numb to feel anything new, sank with a cold, heavy weight. The carriage door was opened by a footman whose face was as pale and impassive as marble. He did not offer a hand, merely stepped back and waited for her to alight. The great oak doors of the manor swung open without a sound, revealing a hall that could have contained her entire former home. It was a cavern of shadows and silence. A vast, cold fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean and empty. The air was frigid, carrying the scent of beeswax and something else, something like old grief. A woman stood waiting at the base of a sweeping staircase, her hands clasped before her. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine that rustled like dry leaves. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice devoid of welcome. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. His lordship will see you in the library." Ilara murmured a greeting, her own voice sounding thin and inadequate in the echoing space. She followed the housekeeper across a floor of polished black and white marble, her footsteps seeming to profane the funereal quiet. They passed portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her with cold disapproval. Every surface gleamed, yet the house felt utterly lifeless, a perfectly maintained tomb. Mrs. Gable stopped before a pair of towering mahogany doors and knocked once, a sharp, precise rap. A voice from within, low and resonant, commanded, "Enter." The housekeeper opened the door and stood aside, her expression unreadable. Ilara gathered her courage, straightened her spine, and stepped inside. The library was a vast two-story room lined from floor to ceiling with books that she knew, instinctively, were never read. A fire, the first sign of life she had seen in the house, burned reluctantly in the grate, its flames casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel even larger and more intimidating. And behind a massive desk of dark carved wood sat the Marquis of Ashbourne. He did not rise. He simply watched her approach, his eyes a startlingly pale grey, the colour of a winter sky. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, but there was an ageless quality to him, as if he had been carved from the same granite as his home. His face was a study in harsh, elegant lines, his black hair showing no inclination to softness. He was dressed in immaculate, severe black, the only relief a stark white cravat at his throat. He was, she thought, with a detached part of her mind, a devastatingly handsome man. But his beauty was that of a storm cloud, or a hawk, something to be admired from a great distance. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was the one she had heard through the door, a low baritone that seemed to absorb the sound in the room rather than add to it. He gestured to a single, straight-backed chair placed before the desk, a seat for an supplicant, not a guest. "My lord," she said, inclining her head and taking the seat. She kept her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, refusing to be intimidated. She had faced down bailiffs and creditors. She would not be cowed by a mere marquis. He regarded her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. It was a look of appraisal, cold and clinical, as if he were judging a livestock. "Your references are adequate," he began, as if this were a great concession. "Your education is sufficient. Your circumstances, I am given to understand, are unfortunate." A flush of heat rose to her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. "My circumstances are as they are, my lord. They have necessitated my seeking employment." "Indeed." He leaned back slightly, his fingers steepling before him. "Let us be clear about the nature of this employment, Miss Vance. I require a governess for my daughter, Rose. Her education has been neglected. You will rectify that. You will teach her letters, her numbers, French, geography, and whatever else is deemed appropriate for a girl of her station. You will be responsible for her deportment and her daily routine. Your duties begin after her breakfast and end when she is delivered to her nurse for the evening. You will take your meals in your room. You are not to entertain guests, nor are you to wander into the east wing of the manor, which is kept private." The litany of rules was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone. He was not making requests, he was issuing decrees. "I understand, my lord," she said, her voice steady. His pale eyes narrowed slightly. "I do not think you do. My daughter is not an easy child. She is quiet. You will find that she does not engage in frivolous chatter. Your task is to educate her mind, not to fill her head with sentiment or fanciful notions. I expect you to maintain a professional distance. You are her instructor, not her friend. There will be no emotional displays, no coddling. Is that understood?" The coldness of his words was breathtaking. He spoke of his own child as if she were a difficult piece of machinery to be managed. A knot of pity and something like anger tightened in Ilara's chest. "And the child's mother?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. It was a flagrant breach of protocol, but the cruelty of his detachment compelled her. For the first time, a flicker of something raw and unguarded crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant, a shutter closing over a light. His expression became even more rigid, his voice dropping to a temperature that could have frozen water. "Lady Ashbourne is deceased. Her memory is not a subject for discussion. You will not speak of her to my daughter nor to anyone else in this household. Ever." The finality in his tone was absolute. He had drawn a line, sharp and dark as a crack in ice. Ilara inclined her head again, a silent acquiescence. She could see now why the solicitor had been so grim. This was not a house of mourning. It was a house where mourning was forbidden, where grief had been locked away to fester in the dark. "Your salary will be paid quarterly," he continued, his voice returning to its dispassionate monotone. "Your performance will be reviewed. If you prove unsatisfactory, your employment will be terminated without notice. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms and introduce you to the child." He picked up a pen from his desk, a clear and final dismissal. The interview was over. Ilara rose, her limbs feeling stiff. "Thank you, my lord." He did not look up. He had already moved on, his attention fixed on a ledger before him, as if she had already ceased to exist. She turned and walked from the room, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft, definitive click. Mrs. Gable was waiting in the hall, her expression as placid and unrevealing as ever. "This way, Miss Vance," the housekeeper said, leading her up the grand staircase. As they ascended into the upper gloom of the house, Ilara felt the full weight of the terms she had just accepted. She was to be a ghost in this house of ghosts, an instructor to a silent child, an employee of a man whose heart was as cold and hard as the granite walls around them. She had sought refuge, but she feared she had found a prison. Mrs. Gable led her down a long, carpeted corridor in the west wing. The air here was just as cold, the silence just as profound. "These will be your rooms," she said, opening a door. "A sitting room and a bedroom through there. The nursery is at the end of the hall." The rooms were spacious and well appointed, with a small fireplace where a meagre fire had been laid, but not lit. The furniture was heavy and dark, shrouded in dust sheets that Mrs. Gable began to methodically remove. It was all clean, all perfectly maintained, but utterly without warmth or personality. It was a guest room for a guest who was not expected to stay long. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Ilara said, setting her small case down. The housekeeper paused, her hand on a dust sheet. For a moment, Ilara thought she saw a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in the woman's stern eyes. "Lord Ashbourne. He has not been himself for a long time, miss. The house, it has not been happy since the late Marchioness passed." It was the most personal statement the woman had yet made, and it hung in the air, like a confession. "When did she—" Ilara began, but Mrs. Gable had already straightened up, her professional mask firmly back in place. "The child's name is Rose. She is 7 years old," she said, her tone briskly changing the subject. "She will be brought to you in the morning. Dinner will be sent up to you at 7. She gave a curt nod and departed, leaving Ilara alone in the silent room. Ilara walked to the window and looked out. The fog was thicker now, pressing against the glass, obscuring whatever view there might have been. It erased the world, leaving only the house, isolated and alone. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a loneliness so sharp it was like a physical ache. She thought of the silent child she was to teach, a girl named Rose, living in a house with no light or warmth. She thought of the cold, broken man who was her father. He had forbidden sentiment, but Ilara knew that a child could not be taught by rote alone. A mind could not flourish where a heart was starved. Her own heart ached with the memory of her losses, but here, in this place of suffocating sorrow, she felt a strange, new stirring. It was not hope, not yet. It was a flicker of something quieter, more stubborn. It was resolve. She had been hired to do a job, to teach a child. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her task here would be far greater than that. She was not just here to teach letters and numbers. She was here to let in the light. And as she stood at the window, staring out into the impenetrable grey, she wondered if there was any light left in the world strong enough to pierce the darkness of Ashbourne Manor. Later that evening, a young maid with wide, nervous eyes brought her a dinner tray. The girl, who introduced herself as Mary, curtsied and set the tray on a small table by the unlit fire. "Will you be wanting the fire lit, miss?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Yes, please, Mary." "Thank you," Ilara said, offering a small smile. The girl seemed startled by the gesture, as if kindness were a foreign currency in this house. As Mary skillfully coaxed a flame from the kindling, Ilara asked gently, "Have you been at Ashbourne long?" "All my life, miss. Me mum was in service here before me," Mary whispered, her eyes darting towards the door as if she expected the Marquis to appear at any moment. It weren't always like this. Before she died, the house was full of music. The mistress, she loved to laugh." The fire caught, and Mary stood up quickly, smoothing her apron. "I shouldn't be talking, miss. His lordship doesn't like gossip." She gave another hasty curtsy and practically fled the room. Ilara ate her solitary meal, the silence broken only by the crackle of the new fire. Mary's words echoed in her mind. It weren't always like this. It was a common enough refrain in a house of grief. But here it felt different. The absence of the late Marchioness was not a quiet sorrow. It was a violent, gaping wound that had been hidden away, but left to fester. The entire household was trapped in the past, held hostage by a grief that was not allowed to be spoken. The next morning, as promised, there was a soft knock at her door. Ilara opened it to find a stout, red-faced woman in a nurse's uniform, and holding her hand was a small, pale girl. This was Rose. She was a tiny, delicate thing, swallowed by a drab grey dress. Her hair was the same jet black as her father's, but fine and wispy, framing a face that was exquisitely beautiful and utterly blank. Her eyes, large and dark, were fixed on the floor. She did not look at Ilara. She did not seem to be looking at anything at all. "This is Lady Rose," the nurse said, her tone brusque. "She's had her breakfast. She's yours until 5. Without another word, the nurse released the child's hand, turned, and marched away, her footsteps receding down the long hall. Rose did not move. She stood on the threshold, a small, still statue of a girl. Ilara knelt, bringing herself to the child's level. She kept her voice soft. "Good morning, Rose. I am Miss Vance. I am so pleased to meet you." The child said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the intricate pattern of the carpet. "Shall we go into the schoolroom?" Ilara suggested gently. I believe it is just next door." She waited. Rose gave no sign of having heard. After a long moment, Elara stood and held out her hand. "Come," she said softly. Slowly, as if moving through water, the little girl raised her head. Her eyes, dark pools of silent sorrow, met Elara's for a fleeting second before darting away. But she took a hesitant step into the room. It was a start. The first days and then weeks at Ashbourne settled into a monotonous and chilling routine. Each morning, Rose would be delivered to her door, a silent, passive doll. They would spend their days in the designated schoolroom, a cold, north-facing chamber with tall windows that looked out onto a barren courtyard. Elara tried everything she could think of. She read stories with animated voices, she drew pictures, she laid out blocks and maps and colorful charts. Rose's reaction to it all was the same: silence. She would sit where she was placed, hold the book she was given, but her eyes were distant, her spirit seemingly absent from the room. She was an impeccably obedient child. She caused no trouble, she made no fuss, but she was not there. Her silence was not shy or stubborn. It was a profound and unnerving emptiness, as if she had locked herself away in a place no one could reach. Elara observed the rest of the household from her detached position. She saw Lord Ashbourne only fleetingly, a glimpse of him crossing the great hall or riding out on a black stallion, a solitary figure against the grey landscape. He never visited the schoolroom. He never asked after his daughter's progress. It was as if he had handed over a broken toy and had no interest in whether it could be mended. The staff moved about their duties with a hushed efficiency, their faces guarded. They were polite to Elara, but distant, as if she were a temporary fixture they had been warned not to get attached to. The house itself seemed to conspire in this atmosphere of repression. It was always cold, even when fires were lit. The silence was so deep that the sudden creak of a floorboard or the distant clang of a pot from the kitchens was a startling intrusion. And then there was the east wing. The door to it was at the end of the main gallery on the first floor. It was a simple door of dark oak, no different from any other, but it was always closed. No one ever used it. One afternoon, driven by a curiosity that was beginning to border on obsession, Elara walked to it and rested her hand on the cool brass knob. It was locked. As she stood there, Mary, the young housemaid, came hurrying down the gallery with a stack of linens. When she saw where Elara was, she stopped dead, her face paling. "Oh no, miss," she whispered, her eyes wide with genuine fear. "You mustn't. No one goes in there." "Why not, Mary?" Elara asked quietly. It's the mistress's old rooms. His lordship had them locked after the accident. He won't have anyone go near. It's been 5 years. The girl clutched the linens to her chest as if they were a shield. Some say her ghost is still in there, that she's waiting for him." Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the hall. A locked wing, a silent child, a man who was a ghost in his own life. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they formed a picture of such profound misery that it was hard to look at. This was not just a house in mourning. This was a house haunted, not by a spirit, but by a memory so terrible it had poisoned everything. This was the first true glimpse she had into the rot at the core of Ashbourne Manor, the understanding that the coldness was not an absence of feeling, but a deliberate, violent suppression of it. That evening, as she sat in her room, a storm broke over the moors. Rain lashed against the window panes, and the wind howled around the eaves of the great house like a grieving animal. The storm felt like a manifestation of all the unspoken anguish trapped within the walls. Ilara looked at the untouched books, the unused maps, and felt a wave of despair. How could she teach a child about the world when the child refused to live in it? How could she bring warmth to a heart that had been frozen by some unspeakable tragedy? She was failing. The Marquis's cold dismissal of her seemed to echo in the wind. If you prove unsatisfactory. But as the storm raged, something else rose in her. It was that stubborn flicker of resolve, burning brighter now in the face of the darkness. The formal methods were not working. The schoolroom was a cage. If she could not reach Rose through books and lessons, she would have to find another way. She would have to find a door into the child's locked world, even if it meant breaking every rule the Marquis had so coldly laid out. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp and clear. Instead of guiding Rose to the schoolroom, Ilara took the child's small, unresponsive hand. "We are going for a walk, Rose," she said, her tone gentle but firm. For the first time, the child resisted, pulling back slightly. Her eyes widened with a flicker of alarm. The routine was being broken. "It is all right," Ilara said soothingly. "We will not go far. Just outside." She led the child down the grand staircase, past a startled footman, and out a side door that opened onto the vast, sprawling grounds. The formal gardens near the house were impeccably manicured, a rigid display of geometric hedges and gravel paths. It was beautiful, but sterile. It was not what Ilara was looking for. She guided Rose along the side of the house, towards the back of the forbidden east wing, and there, hidden behind a crumbling stone wall and a heavy, wrought-iron gate that hung crookedly on its hinges, she found it. It must have once been a magnificent garden. She could see the ghost of its design, the elegant sweep of a path, the stone basin of a dry fountain, the skeletal remains of climbing roses clinging to a trellis. But now it was a wilderness. Weeds choked everything, growing thick and high. Thorns and brambles snaked across the paths, and the flower beds were a tangled riot of neglect. It was a place of profound decay, a mirror of the sorrow that saturated the house. Yet it was not entirely dead. Here and there, a splash of defiant colour appeared, a cluster of bluebells pushing through the weeds, a hardy daffodil blooming bravely in a thicket of nettles. Life was still here, buried but persistent. Rose had stopped at the gate, her small body rigid. She stared into the overgrown chaos, her expression unreadable. Ilara pushed the creaking gate open. "Let's go inside," she said softly. She led the child a few steps into the neglected space. The air here was different, thick with the smell of damp earth, of decay, and faint, lingering perfume. Ilara knelt and touched the petal of a wild bluebell. "Look, Rose, isn't this a lovely color?" The child did not respond, but her gaze followed Ilara's hand. Her eyes were fixed on the small, delicate flower. Ilara did not press her. She simply began to work. She found a pair of rusted shears in a dilapidated potting shed and started to clear a small patch of weeds from around a struggling rose bush. Her hands were unaccustomed to the labor, and she soon had scratches on her arms and dirt under her fingernails. She did not speak to Rose, did not ask for her help. She simply worked, humming a soft tune under her breath, a half-remembered melody from a happier time. For a long time, Rose just stood and watched, a silent observer on the edge of the chaos. Then, tentatively, she took a few steps closer. She crouched down and, with a tiny, hesitant finger, she touched the petal of a bluebell, just as Ilara had done. It was the first independent, curious action Ilara had seen her take. It was a tiny seed of hope planted in the midst of all this decay. They spent an hour in the garden before Ilara led Rose back inside, her dress smudged with dirt. The nurse who met them at the door gasped in horror. "What have you been doing? Look at the state of her." "We were getting some fresh air," Ilara said calmly, meeting the woman's indignant gaze without flinching. She knew she had crossed a line. The garden was clearly part of the forbidden territory of the late Marchioness, but she also knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her, that she had done the right thing. The key to unlocking Rose's silent world was not in a book or a lesson. It was here, in this wild, forgotten place. Restoring this garden, she realized, would be a far more important lesson than any she could teach in a classroom. It would be a lesson in healing. Over the next few weeks, the garden became their sanctuary. Every day, weather permitting, they would spend the afternoon there. Ilara bought proper gloves and tools with her own money on a rare trip to the local village. She learned to identify the weeds from the dormant perennials, to prune the overgrown shrubs, to turn the compacted soil. Rose remained her silent companion, but her silence was changing. It was no longer empty, it was watchful, attentive. She would sit on an old stone bench that Ilara had cleared of ivy, her dark eyes following Ilara's every move. She never offered to help, but one day, as Ilara was struggling to pull up a particularly stubborn root, she found a small, smooth stone and placed it by Ilara's hand to use as a lever. Ilara's heart swelled. She took the stone and smiled at the child. "Thank you, Rose. That is very clever of you." Rose looked down, a faint blush coloring her pale cheeks, and for the first time, Ilara felt they were not a governess and her charge, but two people sharing a common purpose. Slowly, painstakingly, a small corner of the garden began to transform. A patch of earth was cleared, revealing the rich, dark soil beneath. The old stone path became visible again. Ilara found a packet of forget-me-not seeds in the potting shed, and, with Rose watching, she carefully sowed them in the cleared bed. They were in the garden one afternoon, Ilara on her knees weeding and Rose tracing the patterns of moss on the stone bench, when a shadow fell over them. Ilara looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and her breath caught in her throat. Lord Ashbourne stood at the crooked gate, watching them. His tall frame was rigid, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Ilara had no idea how long he had been standing there. He had made no sound. Her first thought was of his rules. She was in a forbidden place. She had his daughter in a state of disarray, her dress smudged with dirt. She had failed on every count he had laid out. She braced herself for the cold fury, for the inevitable dismissal. She rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "My lord," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He did not speak. His gaze moved from her to the small cleared patch of earth, to the struggling rose bushes she had pruned. Then his eyes rested on his daughter. Rose had frozen on the bench, her small body tense. She was staring at her father with a wide, fearful expression. The Marquis took a step into the garden, his polished boots stark against the wild earth. He walked slowly towards the bench where Rose sat, his eyes never leaving her. The air grew thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. Elara held her breath. He stopped a few feet from his daughter. He looked at her, and his expression, for the briefest of moments, fractured. Elara saw a flash of raw, agonizing pain in his pale eyes, a longing so profound it was shocking. It was the look of a man starving for something he believed he could never have. Then the mask slammed back into place. He turned his gaze to Elara, and his eyes were as cold as ever. "What is the meaning of this, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I believe my instructions were clear." "Forgive me, my lord," Elara said, lifting her chin. She would not be cowed. "The schoolroom was proving unproductive. I thought a change of environment might be beneficial for Rose's education. We are studying botany." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. His lip curled in a faint, humorless sneer. "Botany. I see." He looked back at his daughter, who was now staring at a small cluster of cornflowers that had sprung up near the bench, their blue petals a startlingly vivid splash of color in the green and brown tapestry of the garden. And then the miracle happened. Rose pointed a small, trembling finger at the flowers. Her lips parted and a sound emerged, small and fragile, like the chirping of a baby bird. It was the first word Elara had ever heard her speak. "Blue," she whispered. The word hung in the silent air of the garden, impossibly loud. Elara's heart stopped. She looked at the Marquis. His back was to her, but she saw his shoulders tense, his hands clench into fists at his sides. He stood utterly still for a long moment, a statue of black against the burgeoning life of the garden. When he finally turned, his face was pale, his expression shuttered and tight. He looked at Elara, and the coldness in his eyes was still there, but it was different now. It was the coldness of ice that has been fractured, riddled with 1,000 tiny cracks. He did not thank her. He did not praise her. He simply said, in a voice so low she could barely hear it, "See that she is cleaned up for dinner." Then he turned on his heel and strode away, disappearing back into the shadows of the house, leaving Elara and Rose alone in the quiet afternoon, with a single perfect word still echoing between them. That evening, Elara sat by her window, watching the twilight bleed across the sky. The encounter in the garden had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She had seen behind the Marquis's mask, and the glimpse of the tormented man beneath was more unsettling than his coldness had ever been. He was not unfeeling. He was drowning in feeling, and had built the walls of Ashbourne and the fortress of his own silence to keep from being consumed by it. Soft knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper's face was, as usual, impassive, but her eyes held a new light as she looked at Elara. "His lordship asked me to convey a message," she said, her voice holding a hint of something Elara couldn't quite decipher. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "He says that if you require any new gardening implements or seeds, you are to give a list to the head gardener, and it will be provided." Elara stared at her, stunned into silence. Mrs. Gable allowed herself a small, tight smile. "The child. She spoke at the dinner table tonight, miss. Just one word. She asked the footman for more." The housekeeper's stern facade cracked for a moment, revealing a flash of genuine emotion. "We have not heard her voice in 5 years, not since the day her mother—" She stopped herself, her professionalism reasserting itself like a snapped corset string. "Good evening, Miss Vance." She turned and left. Elara sank into her chair, her mind reeling. It was not praise, it was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a concession. It was a key, turning slowly in a rusted lock. In the silent, oppressive world of Ashbourne Manor, it was a revolution. The change, after that day, was subtle but undeniable. The atmosphere in the house did not warm, but the chill seemed less biting. The staff's guarded politeness towards Elara softened with a new, unspoken respect. They had all heard Rose speak. They all knew who was responsible. Rose herself began to blossom, slowly and tentatively, like the flowers in their reclaimed garden. The single word became two, then a short, hesitant sentence. She began to ask questions, her little voice still quiet and reedy, but filled with a dawning curiosity. She pointed to a bird and asked, "What is that?" She held up a ladybug on her finger and whispered, "Is it magic?" The schoolroom lessons were no longer a silent battle of wills. Rose began to show an aptitude for letters, her progress startlingly swift now that the dam of her silence had broken. But the garden remained their true classroom, the place where the most important lessons were learned. They worked together now, Rose a dedicated, if small, assistant, her hands grubby and her face smudged with dirt as she helped Elara plant rows of lavender and sweet peas. Lord Ashbourne kept his distance. He never came to the garden again, nor did he visit the schoolroom. But Elara often felt his eyes on her. She would look up from her work to see him standing at the window of his library, a dark, motionless figure watching them, before he would step back into the shadows. He said nothing more to her, but the promised supplies arrived. New spades and trowels, bags of rich soil, and packets of seeds for every flower imaginable. It was his silent, grudging sanction. Their fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon by the unexpected arrival of a carriage. It was far grander than the estate's sober conveyance, a gaudy confection of gleaming black lacquer and polished brass that rolled up the gravel drive with an air of arrogant self-importance. Elara and Rose were on their way back from the garden when they saw it. A woman was alighting, dressed in the height of London fashion, a swirl of sapphire silk and extravagant feathers. She tapped her foot impatiently as the footman lowered the step, her expression one of bored disdain as she surveyed the grim facade of Ashbourne. Mrs. Gable hurried out to meet her, her face unusually flustered. "Lady Beatrice," she said, her curtsy stiff, We were not expecting you." "Of course you weren't, Gable," the woman said, her voice high and sharp. "If I announce my intentions, my dear cousin Alistair would simply flee to the farthest corner of Scotland. It is better to take him by surprise." She swept into the hall, her silk dress rustling aggressively. Her eyes, small and sharp, immediately fell upon Elara and Rose. She scanned Elara from head to toe, her lip curling in a dismissive sneer that took in Elara's simple dress and the smudge of dirt on her cheek. Then her gaze settled on Rose, who had instinctively shrunk behind Elara's skirts. "And this must be the little creature," Lady Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that failed to conceal its condescending edge. "Come here, child. Let me look at you." Rose pressed closer to Elara, her small hand gripping the fabric of her skirt. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. She looked at Elara as if she were an inconvenient piece of furniture. "And you are?" "The nursemaid." "I am Miss Vance, the governess," Elara replied, her voice calm and level. "Ah, the governess." Lady Beatrice made the word sound like an insult. "Well, you may take the child away and see that she is made presentable," I am here to see my cousin." At that moment, Lord Ashbourne appeared at the top of the stairs. He had clearly heard the commotion. His face was like a thundercloud, his eyes cold with fury. "Beatrice," he said, his voice a low growl, "what are you doing here?" "Alistair, darling," she cried, her entire demeanour changing in an instant. She became a vision of concerned affection, her hands fluttering to her chest. "I was so worried. Months without a word. I had to come and see for myself that you hadn't wasted away entirely in this dreadful place." "I am perfectly well," he said, descending the stairs slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a history between these two, Ilara realized, a long and unpleasant one. "Your concern is, as always, misplaced." "Nonsense," Lady Beatrice trilled, ignoring his icy tone. She gestured towards Ilara and rose. "I arrived to find your daughter looking like a common mudlark, hiding behind this person. You are clearly in need of a woman's touch about the place, Alistair. This is no way to raise the future Lady Blackwood." Alistair's gaze flickered to Rose, cowering behind Ilara, and then to Ilara's calm, protective stance. He said nothing, but Ilara saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice clipped, "please take Rose to the nursery." Ilara nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Rose's shoulder. "Come, little one," she murmured, and led the frightened child away. But as she went, she heard Lady Beatrice's parting shot, her voice carrying clearly up the staircase. "Honestly, Alistair, a governess, with her family's reputation, you might as well have hired a fox to guard the hen house. I'm sure she has her sights set on far more than the girl's education." Ilara's cheeks burned, but she did not falter. She delivered Rose to the nursery, soothing the child's fears with a quiet story before returning to her own rooms. Lady Beatrice's presence was like a poison being injected into the house. The fragile, tentative peace she had cultivated was already beginning to wither. The days that followed were a trial. Lady Beatrice installed herself in the finest guest suite and set about trying to rearrange the household to her own liking. She was a whirlwind of sharp commands and thinly veiled insults, treating the staff with contempt and Ilara with open hostility. She seemed to possess a special talent for finding the most sensitive point and pressing on it with unerring cruelty. She would interrupt lessons, bearing expensive but inappropriate gifts for Rose, a porcelain doll with a cold, vacant face, a box of cloyingly sweet candies. "A girl needs pretty things," she would declare, casting a pointed look at the simple wooden toys and nature books Ilara used. Not all this dreary nonsense about plants and insects. Rose, however, would have none of it. The child who had once been a passive doll had developed a quiet will of her own. She would thank her great-aunt politely, as Ilara had taught her, then set the gifts aside and return to her lesson or her drawing. She remained quiet and reserved around Lady Beatrice, her hand often seeking Ilara's for reassurance. This, more than anything, seemed to infuriate Beatrice. She saw Ilara's bond with the child not as a success, but as a threat. It was a bond she could not break, and so she sought to undermine it. Alistair remained a remote and thunderous presence. He was forced to endure his cousin's company at dinner each night, a meal to which Ilara was, of course, not invited. But the tension in the house was palpable. From Mary, Ilara heard snippets of the terse, strained conversations, of Beatrice's constant attempts to persuade Alistair to return to London, to sell the estate, to send Rose away to a harsh boarding school. "She wants to be the Marchioness herself, miss," Mary whispered one evening as she brought Ilara's dinner tray. Everyone knows it. She was after him before he ever met the first mistress, and she's been circling ever since she passed. She thinks if she can just get rid of you and the little one, she'll have him. The thought was chilling. Ilara had not considered that Beatrice's motives were so nakedly ambitious. She had assumed it was simple malice. But this was far more dangerous. Beatrice was not just a nuisance. She was a predator, and Ilara and Rose were in her way. The uneasy, unspoken alliance between Ilara and the Marquis was now a tangible thing. He could not, for reasons of propriety and family ties, simply throw his cousin out, but his opposition to her was clear. On the rare occasions their paths crossed in the halls, his eyes would meet Ilara's for a brief, significant moment. It was a look that conveyed a shared burden, a mutual understanding of the threat Beatrice represented. They were on the same side, defending the fragile peace of the house and the well-being of the child at its heart. The crisis came to a head a week after Beatrice's arrival. It was a cool, overcast afternoon, and Ilara had taken Rose to the garden. It was their haven, the one place Beatrice, who disdained dirt and insects, would not follow. The garden was truly transformed now. The roses were budding, the paths were clear, and the beds were filled with the bright, hopeful green of new life. They were tending to the new forget-me-not patch when Lady Beatrice appeared at the gate, her face a mask of fury. She had clearly worked herself into a rage. "There you are," she snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "I have been looking everywhere for you, hiding in this disgusting thicket like a pair of gypsies." Ilara rose slowly, positioning herself slightly in front of Rose. "Can I help you, Lady Beatrice?" "You can help me by packing your bags," Beatrice spat. "I have just had a most illuminating conversation with my cousin. I told him it is entirely inappropriate for you to be here. A disgraced woman of no standing, filling his daughter's head with who knows what sort of nonsense. He needs a wife, a proper lady to run this house, not a scheming little governess." Rose, hearing the venom in her great-aunt's voice, began to tremble. Ilara kept her own voice even. "My position here is at the discretion of Lord Ashbourne, not you." Beatrice's face contorted with rage. She took a step into the garden, her eyes wild. "You think you have him wrapped around your little finger, don't you? You and this pathetic, silent child. You are nothing. You are a temporary amusement. Do you know what they say happened here? In this very garden." She gestured wildly at the space around them. "His first wife, the beautiful Isabella. She fell from that balcony up there." She pointed to the east wing. "They say she jumped, that she couldn't bear another moment in this dreadful house with that cold, heartless man. And she was 100 times the woman you are. He will never care for you. He is incapable of it. He destroys everything he touches. He will destroy you, and he will destroy this child, just as he destroyed her mother." A small, choked cry came from behind Ilara. Rose stood frozen, her face as white as paper, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it stole the breath from Ilara's lungs. The cruel, poison-tipped words had found their mark. Before Ilara could react, a voice, low and lethal, cut through the air. "That is enough, Beatrice." Alistair was there. He had come from the house, and he moved with a speed and grace that was terrifying. His face was no longer a mask of stone. It was the face of a wrathful god. The coldness was gone, replaced by a white-hot fury that seemed to radiate from him. "You will be silent," he commanded, his voice shaking with restrained violence. You will go to your room. You will have your things packed, and you will be gone from my house within the hour." Beatrice shrank back, her bravado evaporating in the face of his rage. "Alistair, I was only—" "You were only being yourself," he interrupted, his voice like the crack of a whip. "A cruel, grasping, venomous woman. I have tolerated your presence for the sake of our name. No longer. Get out of my sight. Now." She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She saw something in his eyes that terrified her. With a strangled sob of fury and humiliation, she turned and fled. Alistair did not watch her go. His attention was fixed on his daughter. Rose was shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He took a step towards her, his hand outstretched, but she flinched away from him, a look of pure fear on her face, and buried her face in Ilara's skirt, her body racked with silent sobs. The look of anguish that crossed Alistair's face was the most terrible thing Ilara had ever seen. It was the look of a man who has just seen his worst fear realized. He had been rejected by his own child. The fury drained out of him, leaving him looking hollowed out, utterly defeated. He looked at Ilara, his eyes pleading. "Miss Vance," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I have her, my lord," Ilara said softly. She knelt and gathered the trembling child into her arms, lifting her up. Rose clung to her, her small arms wrapped tightly around Ilara's neck. "It's all right, little one. I have you. You are safe." She carried the child back towards the house, her heart breaking for the little girl, and for the broken man who stood watching them go, alone in the garden that was the source of all their pain. That night was the longest of Ilara's life. Rose was inconsolable. She did not cry aloud, but was trapped in a state of silent, trembling terror. The nurse was useless, wringing her hands and offering platitudes. Ilara dismissed her and sat with the child herself, holding her, stroking her hair, and murmuring soft, meaningless words of comfort for hours. The doctor was sent for from the village, a kindly old man who could do little more than prescribe a mild sedative and offer sympathetic glances. Beatrice's poison had worked its way deep into the child's fragile psyche. All the progress they had made, all the trust that had been so carefully built, had been shattered in one cruel moment. It was well past midnight when Rose finally fell into an exhausted, fretful sleep. Ilara sat in a chair by the bed, watching the child's pale face in the lamplight, her heart a heavy, aching stone in her chest. She felt a profound sense of failure. She had let this happen. She had not protected her. A soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find Lord Ashbourne standing there. He looked as if he had aged 10 years since the afternoon. His cravat was loosened, his hair was dishevelled, and the torment in his eyes was raw and unconcealed. "How is she?" he whispered. "She is sleeping, finally," Ilara said, her voice tired. The doctor gave her something to help. He nodded, his gaze going past her to the small figure in the bed. "May I?" Ilara stepped aside, and he walked into the room, moving with a quietness that was at odds with his size. He stood over his daughter's bed, looking down at her, and the pain on his face was so naked it was difficult to witness. "This is my fault," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I should never have let Beatrice in this house. I knew what she was. I let my cowardice, my desire to avoid a scene, put Rose in danger." "You could not have known she would be so cruel," Ilara said softly. He gave a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. Couldn't I? She has always been this way. I have always known it. He turned to face Ilara, his pale eyes searching hers in the dim light. Beatrice spoke a kernel of truth this afternoon, Miss Vance, mixed in with all her venom, about my wife, about Isabella. He paused, and Ilara waited, her heart pounding. She knew he was on the precipice of a confession he had held back for 5 long years. It was an accident, he said, his voice cracking. The official verdict. She was on the balcony of her sitting room, the one that overlooks the garden. The railing was old, rotten. It gave way. She fell. He closed his eyes, as if the memory were a physical blow. I was away, in London, on some meaningless parliamentary business. I received the news by courier. By the time I returned, she was gone. They had already buried her. He opened his eyes, and they were swimming with unshed tears. I never got to say goodbye. I never got to tell her. I found Rose with her nurse, silent. She had seen it happen, the fall. She saw her mother, in the garden, and she never spoke another word. Until you came. He took a ragged breath. I locked up the east wing. I couldn't bear to look at it, to be in her rooms. I let the garden she loved so much fall to ruin. I thought if I could just wall it all off, the pain would lessen. But it only festered. And I walled myself off from my daughter. I saw Isabella's eyes every time I looked at her. I saw my own failure. I was terrified that I would only hurt her more. So I did nothing. I became a stranger to my own child. I let her drown in her silence because I was drowning in my own. He looked at Ilara, his soul bare in his eyes. You came here, and you did what I was too weak, too broken to do. You went into the wild, painful place, and you began to heal it. You gave my daughter back her voice. You brought life back into this mausoleum. And I have done nothing but watch from the shadows, too afraid to help. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and devastating. All the coldness, all the distance was stripped away, revealing the terrified, grieving man beneath. Ilara's heart went out to him, a wave of compassion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. It is not too late, she whispered. He shook his head, a look of despair on his face. She flinched from me today. She looked at me with fear. Beatrice's words, that I destroyed her mother. Rose believes it. She is a child who has suffered a great shock, Ilara said, her voice gaining strength. She is frightened, but she loves you. A child's love is resilient. We will show her the truth. Together. The word hung in the air. Together. It was a promise, a new arrangement, unspoken, but profound. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, and in them she saw a flicker of something she had never expected to see. It was hope, a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed her cheek. It was the slightest of touches, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body. Ilara, he whispered, speaking her given name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. I do not deserve your kindness. Kindness has nothing to do with deserving it, she replied softly. He let his hand fall, a silent battle raging in his eyes. He looked once more at his sleeping daughter, then back at Ilara. Rest, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You have earned it more than anyone. He turned and left the room, leaving her with the scent of his cologne, the ghost of his touch on her skin, and the earth-shattering weight of his confession. The walls between them had not just been cracked, They had been demolished. And in the rubble, something new and terrifying and beautiful was beginning to take root. The following days were a delicate process of rebuilding. Rose remained withdrawn and skittish, but the terror in her eyes began to recede. Elara did not press her, did not return to the garden immediately. Instead, she stayed with her in the nursery, reading quiet stories, drawing, and simply being a calm, constant presence. Alistair, for his part, began to emerge from the shadows. He did not retreat back into his library. He started to take his meals with Rose and Elara in the small family dining room. The first time he appeared, Rose stiffened, her gaze dropping to her plate. The meal was an exercise in excruciating silence, but Alistair did not retreat. He came again the next day, and the next. He did not try to force conversation. He simply sat with them, sharing the space, letting his daughter grow accustomed to his presence again. He began to read to her in the evenings, his deep baritone filling the nursery as he read from books of adventure and mythology. Rose would listen, her expression unreadable, but she did not pull away. It was a fragile truce, a bridge being built stone by painful stone across a chasm of grief and fear. About a week after Beatrice's departure, Elara decided it was time. "Shall we visit the garden today, Rose?" she asked gently after their morning lessons. Rose looked up, her dark eyes uncertain. Is it a bad place?" she whispered. Elara's heart ached. "No, little one," she said, kneeling beside her. "It is not a bad place. It is a beautiful place that became very sad. But we are making it happy again. Your mother loved that garden very much. Making it beautiful again is a way of remembering her." The child considered this. After a long moment, she gave a small, hesitant nod. When they stepped out into the garden, Alistair was there. He was not watching from a window this time. He was standing by the newly planted bed of forget-me-nots, his hands behind his back. He was waiting for them. Rose stopped, her hand tightening in Elara's. Alistair knelt, just as Elara had done so many times, bringing himself down to his daughter's level. His face was open, vulnerable. "Rose," he said, his voice soft, "what happened to your mother was a terrible, terrible accident. It was not my fault, and it was not your fault. It was just sad. So very sad." He pointed to the flowers. "Your mother planted the first roses in this garden. She loved them more than anything. I was wrong to let it become overgrown. I was afraid of the sadness. But Miss Vance has shown me that you cannot run away from sadness. You have to tend to it, like a garden. You have to let the sun in." He looked from his daughter to Elara, his gaze full of a profound, unspoken gratitude. Then he looked back at Rose. "I would like to help. If you will let me, I would like to help you and Miss Vance make this the most beautiful garden in all of England. For your mother." Rose looked at her father, her small face a study of conflicting emotions. Then she looked at Elara, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. Finally, she let go of Elara's hand, took a tentative step forward and pointed to a patch of stubborn weeds. "That one is hard," she said, her voice small but clear. Alistair's face broke into a smile. It was the first true smile Elara had ever seen from him, and it transformed him completely. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "Yes, it is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we can pull it up. Together." From that day on, the three of them worked in the garden. Alistair was clumsy at first, his large hands unaccustomed to the delicate work. But he was a determined student. He learned to prune and to weed, to stake the delphiniums and tie up the climbing roses. Laughter began to return to the garden. First roses, a silvery, tinkling sound that was the sweetest music Ilara had ever heard. And then, eventually, Alistair's, a deep, warm rumble of a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his healed soul. The garden bloomed, and so did they. The professional distance between Ilara and Alistair had vanished completely. They were partners, co-conspirators in the healing of a child and a house. They spoke freely now, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. He told her of his whirlwind romance with Isabella, of her vivacious spirit and her love for life. And she told him of her father, of her quiet life before the deaths, of her own dreams, long since abandoned, of having a family and a home of her own. She was falling in love with him. The realization did not come in a flash, but grew slowly, organically, like the plants in their garden. It was in the way he looked at his daughter, with a love that was now open and unashamed. It was in the way he listened to Ilara, his pale eyes warm and attentive. It was in the shared smiles, the easy companionship, the comfortable silences. But she kept her feelings locked away. She was the governess, he was the Marquis. Their worlds were impossibly far apart. She had brought his daughter back to him and helped to heal his heart, and for that she was grateful. But soon her job would be done. Rose would no longer need a governess, and Ilara would have to leave Ashbourne. The thought was a cold, sharp pain in her chest. One morning, Alistair sought her out in the schoolroom. His expression was serious, almost grim, and her heart sank. This is it, she thought. He is going to tell me my services are no longer required. Ilara, he began, his voice formal. Will you walk with me? She nodded, her throat tight, and followed him out of the room. He did not lead her towards the garden or his library. He led her down the grand staircase into the main hall, and he did not stop there. He turned to the nearest footman. Please summon the entire staff to the great hall, immediately. The footman's eyes widened, but he bowed and hurried off to do his master's bidding. Within minutes, the whole of the Ashbourne staff was assembled, from Mrs. Gable and the butler, down to the youngest scullery maid. They stood in a nervous, whispering crowd, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Ilara stood beside Alistair, her own confusion mounting. What was this about? When everyone was assembled, Alistair turned to face them. He stood tall, his presence commanding the cavernous room. But when he spoke, his voice was not that of a cold master, but of a man humbled and changed. I have called you here today, he began, his voice resonating in the silent hall, to bear witness. For 5 years, this house has been a place of silence and sorrow. I have been a poor master to you, and a poorer father to my child. I allowed my own grief to poison these walls and to hurt the people I was responsible for. I was lost in a darkness of my own making. He paused, and his gaze swept over the assembled faces before coming to rest on Ilara. His pale eyes were shining with an emotion so powerful, so raw, that it made her breath catch. And then, he continued, his voice softening, a light came into this house. Miss Vance came here as a governess to do a job that I was incapable of doing. But she has done so much more. She did not just teach my daughter, she saved her. She faced the darkness in this house and in me with a courage and a compassion that I have never known. She has brought life and laughter back to these halls. She has reminded me what it is to hope. He took a step closer to her, his eyes locked on hers. The entire staff watched, holding their collective breath. "She entered this house as a governess only," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "But she has become its heart, and I find that I cannot bear the thought of this house ever losing its heart again." And then, there, in the great hall, in front of every person in his employ, the Marquis of Ashbourne went down on one knee before her. He took her hand, his touch sending a shockwave through her. "Ilara Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have remade my life. You have remade me. Will you do me the profound, undeserved honor of becoming my wife? Will you be the Marchioness of Ashbourne?" A collective gasp went through the staff. Ilara stared down at him, her mind reeling, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his handsome, earnest face. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a fantasy spun from her own secret, impossible longings. But the warmth of his hand holding hers was real. The adoration in his eyes was real. She could not find her voice. She could only nod, the tears spilling over and tracing paths down her cheeks. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Alistair's face. He stood, still holding her hand, and slid a ring from his own pinky finger, a heavy gold signet ring bearing the Blackwood crest, and placed it on her finger. It was too large, a temporary placeholder, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He leaned in and whispered, his voice for her ears alone. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she breathed, the word finally finding its way past the joyous lump in her throat. "Oh, Alistair, yes." A cheer went up from the staff. Mrs. Gable was openly weeping, dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. Mary was beaming, her face alight with happiness for her. The great cold hall of Ashbourne was filled with warmth and celebration. Alistair smiled, a true, brilliant smile of pure happiness. He kept her hand in his and turned to the staff. "Then let us have champagne," he declared. "For everyone, we have a wedding to plan." Later that evening, after the impromptu, joyous celebration had subsided, Alistair led Ilara to the library. The room that had once been the site of her cold, intimidating interview was now warm and inviting, the fire roaring in the hearth. He poured them both a glass of brandy and led her to the worn leather sofa before the fire. For a long moment, they simply sat, the comfortable silence broken only by the crackling of the logs. Ilara twisted the heavy gold ring on her finger, the reality of the day still sinking in. "Alistair," she began softly, "what you did today, it was so public. Why in front of everyone?" He turned to her, his expression serious. He set his glass aside and took both of her hands in his. "Because I needed to make a statement, not just to them, but to myself. For years, I have hidden from the world and from my own life. My proposal to you. It could not be another secret whispered in the shadows. It needed to be a declaration. I wanted every person in this house to know that you are not a governess I am elevating out of convenience. You are the woman I love, the woman I choose, and you are to be their mistress with all the honor and respect that title commands. I wanted there to be no doubt, no room for gossip or speculation. I wanted to draw a line between the past and the future, our future." His words filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "And Rose," she asked, Is this truly for you, not just for her?" He smiled, a tender, gentle expression. "When I first conceived of this, I admit the thought was a selfish and practical one. How do I keep you here for Rose's sake? But that thought was a fleeting one, Ilara, quickly consumed by something far more powerful. I fell in love with you. I fell in love with your strength, your quiet dignity. I fell in love with the way you saw the broken things in this house and were not afraid, but saw only the potential for them to be beautiful again. I fell in love with you when I watched you kneel in the dirt and bring life back to a place I had only associated with death. You didn't just heal my daughter, Ilara. You healed me. Marrying you is not for Rose's sake. It is for my own. It is the most selfish thing I have ever done, because I cannot imagine a life without you in it. Tears pricked her eyes again. Oh, Alistair, she whispered. I thought I would have to leave, that my time here was ending. No, he said, his voice firm. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Your time here is just beginning. He looked into her eyes, his own shining with sincerity. I love you, Ilara Vance, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. The declaration, so simple and so profound, unlocked the final door in her own heart. And I love you, Alistair Blackwood, she confessed, her voice thick with happy tears. I think I have for a very long time. He leaned in then, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of wild passion, but of deep, reverent tenderness. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures beginning. It was a kiss that sealed the end of a long, cold winter and welcomed the beginning of a glorious spring. It tasted of brandy and firelight and the profound, certain joy of coming home. They were married a month later in the small, ancient chapel on the Ashbourne grounds. It was a simple ceremony, attended only by the staff and the kindly village doctor who stood as Alistair's witness. Ilara wore a simple cream-coloured dress, and Rose, her face alight with a joy that was beautiful to behold, was her bridesmaid, scattering petals from the restored garden down the aisle. When Alistair slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, it felt not like a beginning, but like a completion, the final, perfect piece of a life she had never dared to dream of. 1 year later, Ilara stood on the balcony of what had once been Isabella's sitting room, the very balcony that had been the site of so much tragedy. The east wing was no longer locked. It had been aired out, redecorated, and filled with light. The balcony railing was new and strong, and from it, Ilara, now the Marchioness of Ashbourne, had a perfect view of the garden below. It was a riot of colour and life. Roses of every hue climbed the trellises, beds of lavender and delphiniums swayed in the gentle breeze, and the forget-me-nots formed a carpet of brilliant blue. The sounds of sorrow had been replaced by the buzz of bees and the sound of laughter. Below, Rose, now a happy, chattering 8-year-old, was chasing a butterfly, her black hair flying out behind her. Alistair was with her, feigning an attempt to catch the butterfly in his hands, his movements intentionally slow and clumsy to elicit peals of laughter from his daughter. Ilara rested a hand on her own gently swelling abdomen, a new life, a new promise, growing within her. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a home, filled with light and love and the sound of happiness. Alistair looked up and saw her on the balcony. His face, once a mask of cold grief, was now open and filled with a love so profound it still, after a year of marriage, took her breath away. He smiled and waved, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated joy. She smiled back, her heart so full she felt it might burst. The path that had brought her to Ashbourne had been one of loss and desperation, a fall from grace that had felt like the end of her world. But here, in the place that had once been the heart of sorrow, she had found everything that mattered. She had found a broken child and helped her find her voice. She had found a broken man and helped him find his heart. And in healing them, she had healed herself and found a love greater than she had ever imagined. Alistair left Rose to her butterfly and came to stand behind Ilara, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood together, watching their daughter play in the sun-drenched garden. "Are you happy, my love?" he murmured into her hair. Ilara leaned back against him, her hand covering his. "More than I have words for," she whispered. The shadows of the past were gone, burned away by the steady, brilliant light of their shared love. The future stretched before them, as bright and full of promise as the garden in full bloom. Dear listener, isn't it a curious thing how the places of our greatest pain can, with time and courage, become the soil for our greatest joy? Ilara arrived at Ashbourne Manor, believing her life was over, a story of loss and diminishment. She found a family locked in a prison of grief, a man and a child so wounded they had forgotten how to live. But she did not try to batter down the locked doors of their hearts. Instead, she found a small, neglected patch of earth and simply began to tend to it. She brought her quiet, steady compassion not to the grand tragedy, but to the forgotten corner. And in doing so, she created a space where life could begin again. So often in our own lives, we are faced with problems that feel as vast and imposing as Ashbourne Manor. We see the locked doors in others and in ourselves, and we feel powerless. We believe a grand gesture, a dramatic confrontation, is the only way forward. But the story of Ilara reminds us of a quieter, more profound truth. Healing rarely begins with an earthquake. It begins with the simple, patient act of planting a single seed. It is the choice to weed one small patch of ground, to let in a little more light, to show up day after day with quiet consistency and gentle care. If you are facing a forgotten garden in your own life, or in the life of someone you love, a place of sorrow, neglect, or fear, perhaps the lesson of the Governess is for you. Don't be overwhelmed by the scale of the wilderness. Just begin. Pick up one stone. Pull one weed. Plant one seed of hope. You may be astonished at the life that is just waiting for a chance to bloom. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring.